For weeks after giving birth to my baby, I was still trying to adjust to a life that no longer belonged entirely to me, where time no longer followed any predictable structure, where sleep came in fragments that never fully restored anything, and where every small task felt heavier than it should have. My new house, the one I had managed to buy after years of working exhausting shifts as a hospice nurse, was supposed to be the one place where I could finally recover some sense of stability. A place built with my own effort, my own decisions, my own sacrifices, but that fragile sense of ownership collapsed the moment my phone rang and I saw my mother's name on the screen, because something in the tone of that call immediately felt different, as if she had already decided the outcome before I had even spoken a word, and without any hesitation she told me that she and my sister's family were moving into my house, as if it was already settled, as if my opinion was irrelevant, as if their life I had just built was simply a shared resource she could allocate at will. And when I tried to respond, when I tried to explain that this made no sense, that I had a newborn, that I needed space and peace, she interrupted me mid-sentence and told me that if I did not like it I could leave. And in that moment I understood something I had been avoiding for years, that this was not a misunderstanding, it was a pattern. If you enjoy stories about family betrayal, quiet justice, and people discovering too late the consequences of other people's decisions, subscribe to Unspoken Truth, because this is where those stories are shared every day, where the surface version of family begins to break apart and the real dynamics underneath slowly become impossible to ignore. My name is Elena, and for years I worked as a hospice nurse, which meant I spent my days observing how people lose autonomy in ways that are often invisible at first, how control can shift gradually from one person to another under the justification of care, how families can convince themselves that they are helping when they are actually replacing someone's will with their own. And over time I learned to recognize the subtle signs that most people overlook, the changes in behavior that do not match medical explanations, the sudden dependency that develops too quickly, the quiet decisions made without proper transparency. And that experience changed the way I looked at my own family long before I ever fully understood what was happening inside it. My grandmother had always been a woman who defined herself through independence, someone who made her own choices even when others disagreed, someone whose presence was firm enough that it never needed to be defended. But over a relatively short period of time I began noticing changes that did not fit a natural progression. Her clarity started to fade in ways that felt inconsistent, her reactions slowed down. Her ability to follow conversations became unreliable, and what disturbed me most was not just the decline itself, but how quickly it was accepted by everyone around her without deeper questioning, as if once a certain narrative had been established, no one felt the need to challenge it again. At first my mother explained everything in terms that sounded reasonable on the surface. She said my grandmother was becoming more fragile, that she needed rest, that stress should be avoided, that reducing stimulation was the best way to keep her comfortable, and those explanations worked because they were familiar and easy to accept. But I had spent years in a medical environment where those same words could mean very different things depending on context, and I began noticing details that did not align with what she was saying, especially the medication regimen, the level of sedation that seemed disproportionate, and the persistent confusion that did not match any clear diagnosis I had been told about. The clearest moment came during my grandmother's 90th birthday, a day that should have been centered on dignity, memory, and presence, but instead felt carefully managed, almost staged in a way that made me deeply uncomfortable. She sat in a wheelchair slightly slumped forward, her eyes unfocused, responding slowly to people around her as if she were constantly a few seconds removed from reality, while my mother moved through the room receiving praise, sympathy, and admiration from relatives and friends who saw her as a devoted daughter making great sacrifices. And what unsettled me most was how easily that version of events was accepted, because from a distance it looked like care, but from where I stood it looked like erasure. Not long after that I learned that my mother had obtained legal authority over my grandmother's affairs through a power of attorney that had been signed during a period of confusion. And from that point forward financial activity began that could not be ignored. Large sums of money moved through accounts that my grandmother had previously managed with full independence, totaling more than $400,000 over time, always explained as management, protection, or preparation for her well-being. but the pattern was difficult to reconcile with the person I had known before the decline, and each new detail made the situation harder to dismiss as simple family decision-making. While all of this was unfolding, my own life was already under pressure in ways I was still trying to recover from. Because I had just given birth, I was physically exhausted, emotionally stretched, and adjusting to the constant demands of a newborn, when my mother introduced yet another disruption that pulled everything into the same system of control. She announced without asking that she and my sister's family would be moving into my new house, treating it as an already agreed arrangement, rather than something that required my consent. And when I tried to set a basic boundary, when I tried to explain that this was not possible, that I needed stability for my baby, she responded with the same phrase she always used when challenged, that if I did not like it I could leave. And for the first time I stopped hearing it as a conversation and started hearing it as what it really was, a declaration that my voice had never been part of the decision at all. After that call ended, I did not respond immediately, not because I was uncertain, but because for the first time I allowed myself to sit with the situation without reacting to it on impulse. I stood in my kitchen holding my baby, listening to the quiet sounds of the house that I had built with my own work and sacrifice, and I realized how quickly everything was being reframed by my mother as something she could simply occupy, as if my life was a shared space she still had authority over. And while her messages continued to arrive, each one more certain than the last, describing how they would move in, which rooms they would use, and how they would organize things properly, I began to see something I had been avoiding for years, not just a single overstep, but a consistent pattern where my boundaries were treated as temporary inconveniences rather than real limits. Her messages did not ask, they informed, and that distinction mattered more than anything else, because there was no negotiation embedded in them, no space for disagreement, only assumptions that I would eventually comply, as I had done in smaller situations throughout my life. And yet this time the context was different. I was not just managing my own exhaustion, I was responsible for a newborn. And that responsibility made the stakes clearer in a way that removed emotional confusion and replaced it with something more grounded, a simple recognition that allowing this would not just affect me, it would shape the environment my child would grow into. As I moved through the house that day, carrying my baby and trying to steady my thoughts, my attention kept returning to my grandmother, not because the situations were identical, but because they shared the same structure underneath. The gradual removal of agency under the justification of care. I remembered how my mother had slowly taken control of her routines, how decisions that once belonged to my grandmother were reframed as a help, how changes were introduced without real consultation, and how every step was justified in isolation so that no single action looked alarming on its own, but together they formed a progression that was difficult to ignore once you recognized the pattern. What troubled me most was how easily that progression had been accepted by the rest of the family, because when control is introduced gradually, it rarely triggers immediate resistance, it is normalized step by step, and by the time the outcome becomes obvious, reversing it is already complicated. And I could see that same mechanism beginning to extend toward my own life, not through medical decisions this time, but through physical presence, through the idea that my home could be redefined without my agreement, and through the expectation that I would eventually adjust rather than refuse. Later that day, I started looking more carefully into my grandmother's situation, not relying on family explanations, but focusing instead on what could be independently verified. I reached out to her regular doctor. Though the answers I received were cautious and non-specific, I contacted other relatives, but most of them repeated the same general narrative that had already been established, that she was more fragile, that she needed support, that the family was doing what was necessary, yet none of it aligned with what I had seen before the changes accelerated, and that discrepancy became harder to ignore the more I examined it. In parallel, I reviewed what I already knew from my experience as a hospice nurse, the difference between expected cognitive decline and sudden shifts that often have external contributing factors, the importance of medication review when confusion appears rapidly, and the risk of assuming that behavioral changes are purely age-related without considering other explanations. And as I applied that lens to my grandmother's situation, the picture that emerged was not one of simple deterioration, but one of management, where her condition had been shaped in ways that benefited the person controlling her environment. The more I reflected on it, the more uncomfortable I became with how easily her authority had consolidated around my mother, because it was not just emotional influence, it extended into legal and financial control. And what made it more concerning was the speed at which it had happened without meaningful challenge, as if everyone around her had accepted that she was the default decision-maker. And that assumption itself had created the conditions for everything else to follow. By the time I returned to thinking about my own situation, her plan to move into my house no longer felt like an isolated event. It felt like a continuation of the same structure, the same expectation that other people would eventually adjust, and the same confidence that resistance would fade under pressure or fatigue. But what she did not account for was that my circumstances had changed, not only because I had a newborn, but because I now understood the pattern more clearly than I ever had before. That realization shifted something in me, because instead of engaging in an immediate emotional response, I began to focus on preparation, not confrontation. I reviewed documents related to the house, I checked my legal standing, I quietly reached out to a trusted contact who could provide advice if things escalated, and I made sure that my grandmother's situation was being looked at through channels outside of family influence, without announcing it, without warning, simply ensuring that if what I suspected was correct, there would be an independent record of it. When my mother continued sending messages throughout the day, I no longer read them as instructions. I read them as attempts to maintain control over a situation that was already shifting underneath her. And for the first time in a long time, I was not reacting to her timeline. I was building my own, because I understood that this was no longer about a disagreement over housing or family logistics. It was about whether my life and my child's environment would be defined by my choices or by inherited patterns that had gone unchallenged for far too long. The day my mother arrived at my house with my sister's family felt different the moment the cars pulled into the driveway, not because I was surprised, but because everything I had been observing for weeks finally converged into a single moment that could no longer be delayed or softened by distance or silence. I stood inside holding my baby while listening to the doors open outside, hearing voices that already sounded comfortable, already sounding as if they belonged there. And for a brief moment I did not move, not out of fear, but because I was trying to understand how a space that had been mine alone just hours before was now being entered as if consent had never been part of the equation. When I finally stepped into the living room, the scene was already forming exactly as I had expected. My mother was giving instructions in a tone that assumed compliance, pointing at rooms, suggesting where bags should go, and reorganizing the space verbally as if speaking it into reality would make it true. My sister avoided direct eye contact while managing the children, and my nephews moved through the house with the careless energy of people who had not been told there was anything to question, and my mother barely acknowledged me at first, as if my presence was simply one more element in a plan already finalized. What struck me most in that moment was not the chaos or the physical presence of so many people in my home, but the assumption underneath it all, the quiet certainty that I would eventually adjust, that resistance was temporary, and that my role was to absorb the decision rather than challenge it. And as I listened to her continue explaining how the room should be arranged, I realized that she was not waiting for my approval. She was performing a version of reality where approval was no longer necessary. Inside me, however, something had already shifted long before they arrived, because I was no longer processing this as an isolated conflict. I was seeing it as part of a much longer pattern that I could no longer ignore, the same pattern I had seen with my grandmother, where control was introduced gradually, justified consistently, and normalized through repetition until it no longer felt like control to the people inside it, only like help or a responsibility. And now that same structure had entered my home, except this time I was fully aware of it while it was happening. As my mother continued speaking, I noticed how often she used language that removed agency from the situation. Phrases like, "We will fix this," "we will organize it properly," "this is better for everyone," as if my individuality was already absorbed into a collective decision she controlled. And I realized that arguing at the level of words would not change anything, because the problem was not the explanation. It was the assumption that she had the right to make it in the first place. Later that afternoon, While the house was still filled with movement and unpacking, I received updates that pulled my attention back to my grandmother. Updates that confirmed what I had already suspected but had not yet fully acknowledged, that an independent review of her condition and situation was being initiated, not based on family narrative, but based on external observation and concern. And although nothing had been formally concluded yet, the mere fact that an outside process was now involved immediately changed the balance that my mother had relied on for years. That shift was subtle at first, almost invisible to anyone not paying close attention, but I could see it in the way phone calls started interrupting her conversations, in the way her tone changed when she stepped outside to speak privately, and in the way her confidence, which had always felt absolute, began to develop small cracks that she could not immediately fill with explanation or authority. And for the first time I saw her operate without full control of the environment around her. Inside the house, my sister began to move differently as well, less certainty in her actions, more awareness of the tension she had previously ignored, and even the children seemed to sense that something had changed, not because they understood the situation, but because the emotional atmosphere no longer matched the assumption that everything was normal, and I stayed mostly quiet, not because I was passive, but because I was observing how quickly systems begin to destabilize once there. Authority is no longer unquestioned. By the time evening approached, it became clear that my mother was no longer operating with the same confidence she had arrived with. She still tried to maintain control through instructions and corrections, but now there were interruptions, private conversations, and moments where she had to step away from the group, and each of those moments revealed something important, that her control depended heavily on uninterrupted certainty, and once that certainty was disrupted, even slightly, everything around it began to shift. That night, after the house finally quieted down, I sat alone for the first time since they arrived, holding my baby in the dim light of my bedroom, and I thought about how quickly everything had escalated from a single phone call to a fully occupied home. And yet beneath that surface speed there had been years of slow conditioning, years of boundaries being softened, ignored, or redirected, until the idea of resistance itself felt unfamiliar. And I understood that what I was experiencing now was not a sudden invasion, but the visible form of something that had been building for a long time. And still, even in that moment, I did not feel panic, because I was no longer trying to stop what was happening through reaction alone. I was already moving within a different layer of the situation, one where external review, documentation, and independent verification were already in motion regarding my grandmother, and where my own decisions were no longer being made inside the same closed system that my mother had controlled for years. What she did not realize yet was that the structure she had relied on, the assumption of obedience, the expectation of eventual compliance, and the confidence that no one would escalate beyond the family, was already breaking in ways she could not fully see from inside it. And as I watched her move through my house that night, still trying to hold everything together through habit rather than certainty, I understood that the real shift had already happened long before she ever arrived at my door.